A $15 million missile versus a $13 billion floating city that projects American power across the globe. China believes they've found the kill shot, and they've spent 2 decades perfecting weapons specifically engineered to send US aircraft carriers to the bottom of the Pacific in minutes. You're about to discover why this might be the most dangerous naval standoff since the Cold War, and whether the most powerful warships ever built can actually survive what's coming for them. The DF-21D screams through the upper atmosphere at 12,000 miles per hour. Its warhead adjusts trajectory mid-flight, tracking a carrier strike group 800 miles off the Chinese coast. Aegis radar systems light up across the protective destroyer screen. Fire control computers calculate intercept solutions. The question burning through every Pentagon war game and every Chinese military exercise is deceptively simple. Who wins? The answer determines control of the Western Pacific and possibly the outcome of any future conflict over Taiwan. Welcome to the new era of naval warfare, where decades of carrier dominance face their most credible existential threat. The United States Navy operates 11 nuclear-powered supercarriers. Each displaces over 100,000 tons and carries an air wing of 70 to 80 aircraft, capable of striking targets hundreds of miles inland. These floating air bases have been the cornerstone of American military strategy since World War II, allowing Washington to project overwhelming force to any ocean on Earth within days. A single carrier strike group represents more combat power than most nations possess in their entire military. The USS Gerald R. Ford alone cost $13 billion. And that's before adding the cruisers, destroyers, submarines, supply ships, and aircraft that travel with it. For 70 years, no adversary has successfully sunk an American carrier in combat. That record has made US carriers seem invincible. China looked at that invincibility and saw a problem that required a specific solution. Beijing's answer emerged in the mid-2000s with a weapon system the world had never seen before. The DF-21D became operational in 2006 and earned its nickname immediately: Carrier Killer. This wasn't marketing hype. The DF-21D is the world's first anti-ship ballistic missile purpose-built to do one thing: strike a moving aircraft carrier from ranges that keep Chinese launchers safe on the mainland. The missile's specs tell the story. Range up to 1,300 miles. Speed exceeding Mach 10 during terminal phase. Maneuverable warhead with precision guidance. Payload of 1,300 pounds of high explosive. Circular error probable of just 65 feet, meaning it can hit within that radius of its target. That level of accuracy against a vessel moving at 30 knots through open ocean represents a revolution in military technology. The DF-21D transforms the East China Sea and the approaches to Taiwan into a defensive zone where American carriers operate at existential risk or do not operate at all. But China didn't stop with one carrier killer. The People's Liberation Army Rocket Force deployed the DF-26B in 2015 and extended the threat envelope dramatically. This intermediate-range ballistic missile reaches out 2,500 miles, putting US carriers and naval bases across the second island chain within range. That includes Guam, the critical hub for American air and naval power in the Western Pacific. The DF-26B earned its own nickname: Guam Killer. The missile carries either conventional or nuclear warheads and launches from mobile transporter erector launchers that can relocate rapidly, making them extremely difficult to target preemptively. US intelligence estimates China possesses between 200 and 300 DF-26 missiles. That's not a handful of experimental weapons. That's a deployed arsenal ready for saturation attacks. Then came the DF-17 and the threat level escalated again. This missile deploys a hypersonic glide vehicle that separates from its booster and maneuvers through the atmosphere at speeds exceeding Mach 5. Unlike traditional ballistic missiles that follow predictable arcs, the DF-17's glide vehicle executes extreme maneuvers and evasive actions during its flight. US defense officials confirmed the system demonstrated pinpoint accuracy in testing placing warheads within meters of stationary targets. The hypersonic glide vehicle's unpredictable flight path defeats traditional ballistic missile defense systems designed to intercept missiles following ballistic trajectories. The DF-17 became operational around 2019. China now possesses 3 overlapping carrier-killer systems, each designed to exploit different weaknesses in U.S. naval defenses. The DF-21D for medium range, the DF-26B for extended range, the DF-17 for hypersonic penetration. Together they form the spine of China's anti-access area denial strategy. Here's what that strategy means in practice. In any conflict over Taiwan or the South China Sea, China aims to push American carrier strike groups beyond effective combat range. If U.S. carriers can't get close enough to launch strikes, their air wings become irrelevant. If they try to close the distance, they sail into a missile engagement zone where dozens or hundreds of carrier killers can launch simultaneously. Chinese military doctrine calls for saturation attacks. Not one missile, not 5. Volleys of 20, 30, 50 missiles converging on a carrier strike group from multiple axes simultaneously. The logic is brutal and simple. Overwhelm the defenses through sheer volume. Even if US systems intercept 90% of incoming missiles, 10% of 50 missiles is still 5 warheads getting through. One direct hit from a DF-21D or DF-26B wouldn't necessarily sink a supercarrier immediately. These ships are built to absorb tremendous punishment. But a single hit could absolutely achieve a mission kill. That means damage severe enough to prevent flight operations. No launches, no recoveries. A carrier that can't operate aircraft is just a very expensive target. Multiple hits could absolutely sink the ship. The questions keeping admirals awake at night are whether Chinese missiles can actually find and hit a maneuvering carrier strike group in the open ocean, and whether U.S. defenses can stop them. What do you think? Could Chinese missiles really sink a U.S. carrier, or is this threat overblown? Drop your perspective in the comments, because the answer depends on a kill chain that is never been tested in actual combat, and we're about to break down exactly how that kill chain works and where it might fail. Launching a missile is the easy part. Hitting a carrier strike group that's actively evading and defending itself hundreds of miles offshore is exponentially harder. China's carrier-killer missiles are only as effective as the targeting information feeding them, and that requires a kill chain connecting multiple systems across thousands of miles. Space satellites, over-the-horizon radar, reconnaissance aircraft, drones, command centers, data links. Every link must function flawlessly under wartime conditions, with US forces actively trying to break that chain. This is where theory meets reality, and where Chinese carrier killers face their most significant challenges. The problem starts with basic physics and geometry. A DF-21D launches from mobile launchers in mainland China. From ignition to impact takes roughly 12 minutes for a target 800 miles away. During those 12 minutes, a carrier traveling at 30 knots covers 6 nautical miles. That's significant but manageable with precise initial targeting data. The real problem is that carrier strike groups don't travel predictably. They maneuver constantly, especially when under threat. The missile needs updated positional data during flight to adjust its trajectory. That requires real-time or near real-time tracking of the target throughout the missile's flight. China has invested heavily in the reconnaissance architecture to support this mission. The People's Liberation Army operates multiple satellite constellations, including electro-optical imaging satellites, synthetic aperture, radar satellites, and signals intelligence satellites. These assets provide persistent surveillance of the Western Pacific, identifying and tracking carrier strike groups. But satellites have limitations. They pass overhead on predictable orbits. They can be jammed, blinded, or in wartime scenarios destroyed. Cloud cover degrades optical sensors. Rough seas create clutter for radar imaging. A carrier strike group that knows it's being tracked by satellite can time its maneuvers for when satellites are over the horizon, or employ electronic warfare to degrade satellite sensors. China supplements space assets with over-the-horizon radar systems positioned along its coast. These powerful radars can detect large surface ships at ranges exceeding 2,000 miles. But over the horizon, radar provides bearing and approximate range, not the precision coordinates required for missile targeting. The radar picture tells Chinese commanders a carrier strike group is in a general area. Converting that into an exact targeting solution requires additional assets. That's where reconnaissance aircraft and drones enter the equation. Chinese doctrine envisions long-range maritime patrol aircraft and unmanned aerial vehicles penetrating close enough to carrier strike groups to provide precise targeting coordinates. This is where the mission gets exceptionally dangerous. US carrier strike groups don't travel alone. Each group includes Aegis-equipped cruisers and destroyers forming protective screens. EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft operate from the carrier specifically to jam radars and communications. E-2D Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft provide 360-degree surveillance detecting incoming aircraft and missiles hundreds of miles away. FA-18 Super Hornets and F-35C Lightning fighters maintain combat air patrols. Any Chinese reconnaissance platform trying to get close enough for precision targeting must penetrate or bypass multiple defensive layers. Drones might slip through. Manned aircraft face high loss rates, even if reconnaissance assets successfully locate the carrier and transmit coordinates. The data must flow through command networks to missile launch units, survive the transit through potentially jammed or attacked communications links, and reach the missiles while the targeting information remains current. Assume everything works perfectly. Satellites track the general location. Over the horizon, radar provides bearing. A reconnaissance drone penetrates close enough for precision coordinates. The data transmits successfully to a launch battalion. Multiple DF-21D missiles launch on coordinated trajectories. Now the US carrier strike group's defensive systems engage, and this is where Chinese missiles face layered defenses unlike anything they've encountered in testing. The defense starts at maximum range with SM-3 interceptors. These are specialized anti-ballistic missiles deployed on Aegis destroyers specifically designed to intercept ballistic missiles during their mid-course or terminal phases. The SM-3 Block 2IA can engage intercontinental ballistic missiles during re-entry through the atmosphere. A DF-21D or DF-26B is a smaller, easier target. As of recent tests, the Navy's ballistic missile defense system recorded successful intercepts in 27 of 33 engagements against short and medium-range ballistic missiles. That's an 82% success rate under test conditions. Real combat introduces variables like saturation attacks, electronic warfare, and decoys, but the system is proven. Each Aegis destroyer carries dozens of interceptors. A carrier strike group typically includes 3 to 5 destroyers positioned in defensive formation around the carrier. If incoming missiles penetrate the SM-3 layer, they encounter the next defensive ring. The SM-6 is a multi-mission missile that handles both air-breathing threats like cruise missiles and aircraft and ballistic missile defense. The SM-6 also connects to Naval Integrated Fire Control Counter-Air. This system networks ships with airborne sensors. An E-2D Hawkeye or F-35 flying ahead of the strike group detects an incoming threat and transmits targeting data directly to ship-based fire control systems. The destroyers can launch SM-6 interceptors before their own radars even see the threat. This extends the engagement envelope dramatically, giving defensive systems more time and more opportunities to intercept. Think of NIFCCA as giving the carrier strike group eyes dozens of miles beyond its own radar horizon. That time matters enormously when intercepting Mark 10 missiles, where seconds determine success or failure. Closer in the carrier strike group employs additional defenses. EA-18G Growlers emit high-power jamming signals designed to disrupt missile guidance systems. If the incoming warhead relies on radar for terminal guidance, jamming can blind it or force it off target. The ships deploy Nulka decoys, hovering aerial targets that mimic a ship's radar signature, drawing missiles away from actual vessels. Rolling airframe missiles provide point defense against missiles that penetrate all other layers. Each ship mounts close-in weapon systems, like the Phalanx, basically radar-guided Gatling guns that fire thousands of rounds per minute at incoming threats in the final seconds before impact. The newest carriers and destroyers also deploy high-energy lasers, like the Helios system currently in testing. Lasers offer unlimited magazine depth as long as the ship has electrical power and engage targets at the speed of light. For drone swarms or slower cruise missiles, lasers provide another defensive option without expending missiles. The carrier itself also takes defensive action. These ships are fast. Nuclear reactors provide essentially unlimited high-speed propulsion. When threatened, a carrier can accelerate to over 30 knots and execute radical evasive maneuvers. The ship turns continuously varying speed and heading to complicate targeting solutions. Meanwhile, the air wing repositions. F-35Cs can serve as forward sensor nodes, detecting and tracking incoming missiles. In future scenarios, armed F-35s might intercept ballistic missiles during boost phase before they even reach mid-course. The carrier also deploys its own electronic warfare systems and chaff, creating false targets and degrading missile seekers. Every system operates simultaneously. Aegis destroyers launching interceptors, growlers jamming, the carrier maneuvering, decoys deploying. The defensive picture is a coordinated ballet of overlapping systems, each providing redundancy if others fail. But here's the critical question. Can these defenses handle a saturation attack? 1 DF-21D is manageable, 5 are challenging. 20 simultaneous impacts from different vectors is a nightmare scenario. Chinese doctrine specifically plans for this. Mass launches from multiple locations converging on the target simultaneously. Each Aegis destroyer has a limited magazine. If Chinese forces launch 100 missiles and US defenses intercept 90, that still leaves 10 warheads reaching the carrier strike group. Some analysts argue this is the fundamental math problem that makes carriers vulnerable. Others counter that launching 100 ballistic missiles simultaneously requires extensive preparation that US intelligence would detect. Mobile launchers must move into position. Support vehicles deploy. Communications networks activate. All of this creates signatures that satellites and signals intelligence can detect. The US response to detected preparations might include preemptive strikes on launcher locations or pulling carrier strike groups beyond range until threats are neutralized. This is the chess match playing out in Pentagon war games and PLA planning cells. What's your take? Are layered missile defenses enough, or do saturation attacks make carriers too vulnerable? Comment below with your strategic assessment, because we're about to examine what happens when the missiles actually fly and whether carriers can adapt to survive. None of these weapons have been tested in actual combat against defended targets, and that uncertainty cuts both ways. China has never fired carrier killer missiles at a real carrier strike group with all defensive systems operational. The United States has never defended against a coordinated saturation attack from modern anti-ship ballistic missiles. Both sides run simulations exercises and war games, but nobody knows for certain what happens when theory meets reality. What we do know is this. The threat is serious enough that the US Navy is fundamentally changing how it operates in the Western Pacific and how it thinks about the future of carrier warfare. The adjustments reveal which vulnerabilities admirals consider most pressing and where they believe Chinese missiles pose genuine risks versus theoretical threats. Start with operating concepts. US carrier strike groups no longer assume they can operate freely within the first island chain, the line running from Japan through Taiwan to the Philippines, during a high-intensity conflict with China. Instead, planning focuses on standoff operations. Carriers position themselves beyond the range of most Chinese anti-ship missiles and rely on longer-range strike capabilities. This is where the air wing composition becomes critical. The Navy is investing heavily in the MQ-25 Stingray, an unmanned aerial refueling tanker that extends the combat radius of carrier aircraft. An FA-18 Super Hornet has a combat radius of roughly 450 miles without refueling. Add MQ-25 tankers, and that radius extends to 700 miles or more. Suddenly, a carrier positioned 1,500 miles offshore can still strike targets deep inside the first island chain, while remaining outside the envelope of DF-21D missiles. The same logic applies to future unmanned combat air vehicles currently in development. Long-range stealthy drones, operating from carriers positioned at safer distances, fundamentally alter the calculus. Chinese missiles have fixed ranges. If carriers can strike effectively from beyond those ranges, the carrier killer arsenal loses much of its strategic value. This doesn't make carriers invincible, but it does complicate Chinese planning significantly. The Navy is also distributing its capability across more platforms. The doctrine of distributed maritime operations spreads forces across wider areas, making them harder to target and overwhelming Chinese reconnaissance systems with multiple targets simultaneously. Instead of concentrating around a single carrier group, the fleet disperses across thousands of square miles. Destroyers, armed with Tomahawk cruise missiles, operate independently. Submarines, both manned and unmanned, position themselves to strike targets or gather intelligence. Amphibious ships carry F-35Bs, providing additional aviation platforms that are smaller and less visible than supercarriers. If Chinese forces must track and target 20 dispersed ships across a massive operating area instead of one carrier strike group, the reconnaissance and targeting problem becomes exponentially more complex. Not impossible, but significantly harder and more resource-intensive. Electronic warfare and cyber operations represent another dimension of defense that often receives less attention than kinetic systems, but may prove equally important. US Cyber Command and the National Security Agency have offensive capabilities targeting the networks and systems China relies on for its kill chain. If satellites can't transmit targeting data because their communications links are compromised or jammed, the missiles can't receive accurate coordinates. If command centers processing reconnaissance information come under cyber attack, the kill chain breaks. Similarly, US electronic warfare aircraft and ships can jam the data links connecting Chinese reconnaissance assets to launch units. Breaking one or two links in the kill chain neutralizes the entire system, regardless of how effective the missiles themselves might be. China undoubtedly understands this vulnerability and has hardened its systems, but the electronic and cyber battlespace remains a critical arena where carrier-killer effectiveness could succeed or fail entirely. The question of magazine depth matters enormously. China possesses hundreds of DF-21 and DF-26 missiles, but not unlimited numbers. Each missile fired depletes the inventory. If Chinese forces launch massive saturation attacks in the opening days of a conflict, they may exhaust their stockpiles without sinking multiple carriers. Meanwhile, US shipyards continue building destroyers equipped with hundreds of interceptors. The industrial base and sustainment capacity influences outcomes in extended conflicts. This isn't a video game where missiles respawn. Real-world logistics constrain both sides. Chinese missile production rates determine how long they can sustain high-tempo operations. US interceptor inventories determine how many attacks carrier strike groups can defend against before running dry. Both nations are racing to build deeper magazines because both understand the math matters as much as the technology. Then there's the reality that carrier strike groups don't operate in isolation. Any conflict in the Western Pacific involves the entire US military. B-21 stealth bombers flying from bases in the continental United States or Australia can strike Chinese missile launchers, command centers, and radar installations. Virginia-class attack submarines hunt for Chinese warships and can launch Tomahawk strikes against land targets. F-22 and F-35 fighters based in Japan, South Korea, and Guam provide air superiority and strike capabilities. The carrier is one piece of a joint force operating across domains. Chinese carrier-killer missiles might credibly threaten carriers, but those missiles themselves become targets for US strike systems. Mobile launchers are hard to find, but not impossible, especially once they activate and emit signals. The counter-targeting battle destroying enemy launchers before they fire becomes as important as defensive systems protecting carriers after launch. Some analysts argue this entire discussion misses the strategic picture. Carriers don't need to survive unscathed. They need to survive long enough to accomplish their mission. In a Taiwan scenario, US carriers might operate for the first 72 to 96 hours, absorbing losses, but enabling other forces to establish air superiority, destroy Chinese amphibious forces, and create conditions for sustained operations. If two carriers suffer mission kills, but their air wings and escort ships blunt a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, the strategic outcome is acceptable even though the tactical losses are painful. This is cold calculus, but it reflects how militaries think about acceptable risk. The question isn't whether carriers are invulnerable. The question is whether they can operate effectively despite threats long enough to accomplish strategic objectives. Different question, different answer. The technological competition continues evolving. China develops new missiles with improved guidance and harder to intercept flight profiles. The US develops better interceptors, more capable electronic warfare, and longer-range carrier aircraft. Hypersonic weapons from both sides add new layers of complexity. Directed energy weapons mature from prototypes to deployed systems. Artificial intelligence enhances targeting for attackers and defensive coordination for defenders. Neither side stands still. The balance of advantage shifts continuously. What might be true today about carrier vulnerability could be obsolete in 5 years as new technologies deploy. The only certainty is that both nations are spending billions annually to gain advantages and counter adversary capabilities. Here's what really matters. The threat is credible enough that it shapes US strategy and operations. Carriers are adjusting how they operate, where they position themselves, and what missions they prioritize. But the threat hasn't rendered carriers obsolete or unusable. US carriers continue operating in the Western Pacific, including transiting the Taiwan Strait and conducting exercises in the South China Sea. That demonstrates both capability and resolve. If Chinese carrier killer missiles truly dominated the battle space, US carriers wouldn't operate in those waters. The fact that they do suggests US Navy leadership has confidence in their defensive systems, operational concepts, and ability to manage the risk. That confidence might be justified, or it might be proven wrong if conflict erupts. Nobody knows for certain until the missiles fly for real. The ultimate answer to who wins in US aircraft carriers versus Chinese carrier killer missiles depends on variables that can't be fully known until actual combat. Reconnaissance effectiveness, defensive system performance under saturation attack, electronic warfare outcomes, training and crew quality, luck, all factor into results. What we can say definitively is that China has invested in credible weapons systems specifically designed to hold US carriers at risk, and the United States has responded with layered defenses, operational changes, and counter-targeting capabilities designed to mitigate those risks. The Western Pacific has become the most dangerous maritime environment on Earth for high-value surface ships. Whether carriers can survive and operate effectively in that environment remains the defining question for 21st century naval warfare. The answer determines not just ship survivability, but potentially the strategic balance of power across the Indo-Pacific region for decades to come. If you made it this far, you now understand the complexities that Pentagon strategists and Chinese military planners wrestle with daily. This isn't about invincible carriers or unstoppable missiles. It's about competing systems, kill chains, operational concepts, and the brutal mathematics of modern warfare. If this breakdown gave you new perspective on the future of naval power, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into military strategy and the weapons systems shaping tomorrow's conflicts. The Pacific showdown between American sea power and Chinese missiles will define this era. Now you know what's actually at stake.